Good morning, church. I saw on the outline for the worship order, sermon bump. I didn't know what that meant. And so when I was watching that with you, I was going, what are we going to do here? Advent. I appreciate that very much. I am honored to be a part and share this moment with you and to work with you in terms of living out the story of God and talking about the story of God. I almost followed our brother into the room over there and put that costume on. I thought about it, but I don't think it would have fit me. I'm not sure. We'll see. But it is an honor to be with you because I love this congregation. I love what I know about this congregation, about your heart for the poor, your work with the homeless, your recovery, your work with racial reconciliation. I appreciate all that so much, and it is an honor to be with you today. We all organize our time, right? Used to be we carried around Blackberries. I didn't, I just had my little black book with the date, not a little black book like you're thinking right now, but a black book for a calendar, all right? And we all organize our time. In fact, people help us organize our time, right? Hallmark helps us organize our time. Whether it's Valentine's Day or Mother's Day or Father's Day or all those sorts of Hallmark card days, they organize our time. My wife's birthday is February 13th, and Valentine's February 14th. And I learned early on, you don't combine them. You don't do that. That's not a good idea. But we organize our time in so many ways. Our national calendar organizes our time, right? We have 4th of July, we have Memorial Day, we have Veterans Day. We organize our time. We have federal holidays from Martin Luther King to Thanksgiving Day. There are so many competing dimensions to time organization. And we practice or lean into most of them. We probably practice Valentine's Day in one way or another. We practice July 4th in one way or another. We do Thanksgiving in one way or another. And I think that that's a good thing. It's okay to organize time. In fact, I think when we read Genesis 1, we see God intended us to organize our time. I think that's part of the 7 days there. It gives us a way of thinking about life. There's a rest that needs to be a part of those 7 days. And even in the creation of the sun and moon in Genesis 1 and verse 16, the writer of Genesis says, "This is for a sign and seasons in the world." Now, when he uses the word season, unfortunately, I don't think that's a very good translation, because the word there is the word that is used for festivals. When you read through the Torah, when you read through the books of Moses, the word festival is that word in Genesis 1:16. God organized the world, set the system in motion, the rhythm of life in motion, so that there are seasons of festivals. And of course, when the Hebrew Bible uses the word festival, they're not thinking about Valentine's Day or Thanksgiving Day even. They're thinking about those moments where Israel remembered their God, about those moments when they enter into the presence of God and as a community remember their story and their history with God. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 23, part of the books of Moses is, you will have holy convocations. Now that's just a fancy way of saying you're going to have sacred assemblies. You're going to get together. And when you get together, whether it's on the Sabbath, that's one of the holy assemblies in Leviticus 23, or whether it's the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Passover, or the Day of Atonement, or other festivals that are listed there in Leviticus 23, God instituted a kind of rhythm to life, a sort of rhythm that followed the seasons in some way, that was a part of the calendar of Israel, a rhythm that gave them a sense of identity, a way of remembering, and a way of participating in the story of God. He gave them assemblies where they could gather and proclaim and remember and participate in the story. That's something of what we have going on here in Psalm 66. Psalm 66 is this invitation. Did you hear it? It came twice. This invitation, come and see. Come and see what? The psalm begins with this shout to God, a call for all the nations, for all the peoples of the earth to know who God is. And the invitation to Israel and to the nations to come and see. Come into the assembly. Come into this space and see God. Now, seeing might mean a lot of different things. It might be actually seeing some sort of event that reminds us of who God is and what God has done. It may be a Passover meal. It may be the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. It might be living in booths for the Feast of Tabernacles. Whatever it is, come and see. Come into this space, this assembly of God's people, and see what God has done. As part of the function of gathering is to see what God has done and to remember the history that brought us to where we are. But there's also then another invitation, an invitation to come and listen. Come and experience, come and see, come and remember, come and participate, but come and listen and hear the testimony of other believers who bring their sacrifices of thanksgiving, who bring their moments into the assembly where they give thanks to God for what God has done in their lives, how God has answered prayer in their life, how God has delivered them out of trouble, how God has helped them, and we hear the witness of gratitude to God. Come and listen. And as they offer that sacrifice of thanksgiving, which also included a meal, by the way, the sacrifice of thanksgiving is a sacrifice that you eat. You just don't throw the animal away, but you eat it. And when you eat that animal, you share it with other people. Kind of like Hannah brought a bull and some grain and wine to the tabernacle to give thanks for Samuel, for the birth of Samuel. She shared that with a whole village, probably. The same as kind of context here as well. Come and listen. Come to this meal. I'm offering a Thanksgiving sacrifice, and I'm inviting you to come and hear what God has done for me. And I want to remind you as well that I am going to keep my vow. See, that's kind of something we did just a moment ago. We assembled, and we gave thanks, and we ate and we drank. And we renewed covenant with God that we are going to keep our vows. We made a vow when we were baptized. We made a commitment when we were baptized. We said, I'm going to follow Jesus. And when we come to the table where we eat and drink with God in the presence of the living Christ, we renew that vow with God. And so it's a moment when we can say to each other, come and listen. I want to tell you what God's done for me. God has forgiven me of my sins. God has delivered me from my trouble. God has renewed my life and renewed my marriage and renewed. We want to give witness to what God is doing. And that's kind of what assembly is for. We come to see God, to encounter God, and remember who God is and what God is doing among us. And we come to listen to one another, tell the story of God's redemption in their own lives. And Israel had a rhythm for that. It's a rhythm that they even extended. You know, even in the Torah, you have all these, in Leviticus 23, all these holy convocations or sacred assemblies listed. And God calls them into this rhythm of life and memory. But Israel also added to those. They added to the law. You know, I know the law says don't add or take away from, but it's not talking about this sort of thing at all. Don't add or take away from the ethics. Don't add or take away from the way of life that you're supposed to have here. Don't twist the way into something that it's not. But when God acts, there are moments to create memories. There are moments to remember. There are moments to come together and say, let's celebrate what God did. And so on Esther institutes a new assembly, a new festival, the Feast of Purim, to remember and celebrate how God delivered Israel from the hands of their enemies. And then in about 150 AD, 150 BC, 2nd century before Christ, they instituted another festival, the Feast of Lights, or it's called the Feast of Dedication, to remember how God had delivered them from that moment in the 150s. And Jesus himself attended that festival, John chapter 10. So these sorts of celebration moments, these sorts of memory moments, these sorts of participatory moments, where you proclaim the love of God and the work of God in our lives, is part of the story of Israel and is part of the story Jesus participated in. Because he participated in the rhythm of that calendar. See, I want to suggest to you that it's a helpful thing to not only have a national calendar or a Hallmark calendar or even a seasonal calendar divided into months, but it's helpful to have a Christian calendar. A Christian calendar in the sense that it invites us into the story. It calls us to live by this as our primary commitment. That we are in covenant with God and with the story of Jesus Christ. And that is our primary interest. And that's what should shape us in our primary way of thinking. Now, national calendar can shape us in ways that are so subtle, but also so overt. And the Christian story can sometimes be placed beneath the national story, or even the personal story, or even the seasonal story. It seems to me our fundamental commitment is to the story of Jesus Christ. And that if our fundamental commitment is to the story of Jesus, why should not the story of Jesus regulate our calendars? Why should it not form us and shape us into a people who constantly have the story of Jesus set before us over and over again? We do that every Sunday. We have a regular habit, a calendar habit, you might say, of gathering every week around the table and to be reminded and to tell the story and to proclaim the work of God and to give thanks for what God has done. Early on in Christian history, Christians began to, They began to remember the story of Jesus by having moments in their calendar where they celebrated various moments in the life of Jesus. We know one as Advent. Advent is kind of late in development, but Advent is that moment where you remember the past coming of Christ and you anticipate the future coming of Christ. And that part of that sense is, and we sang about it today, that we embrace love and we embrace joy and we embrace peace. And we still our souls in our waiting, in our remembering and our waiting for the coming of Christ, and our waiting for the coming of Christ not only in terms of the birth of Christ, but our waiting for the coming of Christ in terms of the second coming of Christ. But we wait with no fear. We wait with joy. We wait with peace. We wait with love. And it forms us in this hurried season we're about to enter, from Thursday, Thanksgiving, to Christmas Day, this season of shopping and hurriedness. And we need to find moments of peace and stillness, of calm. Moments that find our peace and our joy and our love in the coming of Christ. Christmas is that where we celebrate, in the 8 days or 12 days after Christmas, we celebrate the birth of Christ. We recognize that something unique happened there. That in Christmas it's not about the gifts, and it's not about the trees, and it's not about all that commercialized reality that gets put upon us. But it's about the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It's about God coming among us. And to celebrate that moment, that unique moment in the history of the world, be able to testify to one another and testify to the world, God has come. Christmas. Or Epiphany, which is about the baptism of Jesus, at least in the Eastern tradition. In remembering the baptism of Jesus, we remember our own baptism. And we renew our baptismal vows by remembering our baptism as people who follow Jesus into the water. And when we are people who follow Jesus into the water, we follow Jesus into the wilderness. And so there are 40 days of Lent, 40 days to refocus, to recenter, 40 days to depend in an explicit way, in a focused way, in a centered way upon our life with God, to encounter God in the wilderness through fasting, prayer, or whatever other habits one might take up, to center themselves in God. And that leads us to Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter. And then beyond to Pentecost. Why would we do any of that? Isn't what we do on Sunday sufficient? Yeah, in one sense it is. Absolutely. When we gather here, we proclaim Christ. And we gather around a table and we renew our covenant. And we give thanks. Nothing would want to disrupt from that whatsoever. But is there a value in recognizing that we live within a story beyond week to week? That we live within a narrative that encompasses not just one Sunday and another Sunday, but that we have entered into the story of Jesus, into the life of Jesus himself. And that as we participate in the story, we live out a narrative and we integrate that narrative into our own lives. I want to suggest to you that living by the Christian calendar can do maybe three things for us. Whether we do it as individuals or whether we do it as a corporate body, I think there's great value in doing it as a corporate body, because we're not in this story alone. We're in this story together. But let me suggest, as we live by the Christian calendar, and we make that the primary calendar in our lives, not only the week-to-week Sunday, but the very narrative of Jesus Christ that is lived out in the Christian calendar. From his birth, his ministry, his baptism, his ministry, his temptations, in the 40 days in the wilderness, to his death and his resurrection, to live out that narrative, to participate in that narrative. Three things. One, we remember. David talked about memory at the table. This is about remembering the story of Jesus from beginning to end. To recall his baptism and how we followed him into the water and participated in his baptism. How we follow him into the wilderness. How we sit with the disciples on Holy Saturday after Good Friday and the crucifixion of Jesus and the lostness, the hopelessness that was felt in that moment and the hopelessness they felt on Holy Saturday, a day where I visit my son's grave, to sit with the disciples and then to celebrate resurrection on Easter. To remember the story of Jesus, that this is the story that we confess and we believe and by which we live. This is our narrative. And I think it's appropriate to think about it as a calendar we live by as well. Second thing we do is we actually participate in this narrative. Whether it's in Advent, the waiting and the candles that represent the waiting, whether as we gather as families and we discuss and we talk about Advent with our children and with our whoever our companions are in that moment, that we live with the anticipation of Israel anticipating the deliverer to come, and we still are waiting for the fullness of that deliverance as we wait for the coming of Christ. To celebrate the birth, to celebrate the baptism, to participate in the life of Jesus. That the life of Jesus is not just some cognitive thing we think about, but that it can actually have a practical and important way of entering into that story. As we as a community remember, just like Israel said, come and see. Let me tell you about the Exodus. Let me tell you about the wilderness. Let me tell you about the promised land. And they reenacted that in their assemblies and in their stories, and by their festivals. It gave them a way of participating in the narrative itself. To remember, to participate, and to proclaim. Proclaim here in the assembly. This is the story we believe. This is the narrative in which we live. These are the values to which we are committed. This is our oath and our vow that we will keep. This is our story. We sing that song sometimes, maybe. This is our story, right? And the calendar gives us a way of proclaiming that. Whether it's an Easter service or whether it's a Christmas service or what, there's a way of saying it. It's an option that we as a community can embrace to remember, to participate, and to recommit ourselves in proclamation of the gospel. To live out the gospel. What a calendar does is it reminds us and gives us a way to participate. It gives us a way to proclaim. Isn't that what we do on Memorial Day? Isn't that what we do on July 4th? If we do that for the nation, and we do that on our birthdays, and we do that on our anniversaries, can we not also say to our God, we are going to enter into your story and remember it, participate in it, and proclaim it from Advent to Pentecost, to tell the story of God and commit ourselves to following and living worthy of that story. So as you begin this season of Advent, let it saturate you. Let Advent sink into your heart. Not as a human tradition, but the point of it. The point of remembering, participating, and proclaiming the coming of Christ. As you enter into the whole season of the Christian story, live it out, remember it, proclaim it, participate in it. And let God be glorified by the rhythm of the seasons, by the rhythm of the festivals, by the rhythm of our commitment to the story of God. Let's lift God up to the highest place. Let's let God be the one who shapes us, informs us, not only in our daily lives, but in our calendars. That doesn't mean we get rid of all the other calendars. Of course not. But we seek first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness. And to give ourselves over to the Christian calendar, to give ourselves over to the story of Jesus, is a way of seeking first the kingdom of God. Prioritizing, saying, this is the story I live. I may live in the United States, but the story I live is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's lift God up to the highest place.